in a dim, candlelit chamber that reeks of incense and rotting wood. An old priest whispers prayers to deaf stone walls, his fingers trembling as he clutches a crucifix so tightly it draws blood. This is not the triumphant end of a hero. This is the final act of a legend unmasked. Once hailed as a savior of France and companion to Joan of Arc, Gilles de Rais fell not on the battlefield, but in a cesspit of depravity that defiled every vow he ever made. Born to power, raised for glory, he plummeted into the abyss with a scream that echoed through the crumbling cathedrals of medieval Christendom. Tonight, we descend into the rotting corridors of his mind, through dungeons slick with blood, where angels dare not tread and devils feast on the flesh of children. The world into which Gilles de Rais first opened his eyes in the spring of 1405 was one sculpted from privilege, prophecy, and the seductive rot of ancient power. His cradle, carved from blackened oak and draped in linens embroidered with the heraldry of old blood, sat beneath a vaulted ceiling painted with angels, cherubic, winged things whose smiling mouths seemed to twitch in mockery when the candlelight flickered just right. From the first breath he drew, sweet with frankincense and damp stone, Gilles was marked not as a man, but as an offering, an heir destined not merely to rule land, but to dominate legend. The castle walls whispered of war and piety, but it was death that tutored him first. At 11 years old, an age where most boys still fumbled wooden swords and clung to nursemaids, Gilles watched his father die screaming, the lower half of his face flayed open by the tusk of a maddened boar, the tongue twitching like a fish in a tide pool of blood. The beast was gutted on the spot, its entrails steaming in the morning frost, and the boy was told to look, and never forget. The corpse of the animal was left to rot in the orchard for days, flies thickening until the air itself became a syrup of buzzing dread. It was the first time Gilles smelled decay, not just of flesh, but of order, of control, and the scent never truly left his nostrils. By adolescence, Gilles was a specter in silver, a boy knight garbed in enchanted armor and fed tales of saints and dragons until his dreams pulsed with fire. He was baptized not in holy water, but in blood and battlefield smoke, his blade slicing through English bone beside a girl with fire in her eyes and God's fury in her voice. Joan of Arc, the maid, the martyr, rode like a storm, and Gilles followed as if possessed, driven by something far more insidious than faith. To march beside her was to taste the edge of divinity, to believe, if only for a moment, that the sins of men could be washed clean in the gore of their enemies. Her voice was a psalm, her gaze an absolution. And when she wept for the dead, Gilles smiled. But fire purifies only the righteous. In the year 1431, when the smoke curled skyward from the pyre in Rouen, and her skin blackened while her soul, if one believes, ascended screaming to heaven, something deep inside Gilles de Rais tore apart with the soundless violence of glass imploding beneath velvet. He stood among the watching nobles as her hair ignited, his eyes unblinking, his hands clenched in fists so tight his nails drew blood from his palms. The scent of burning flesh, once distant, war-born, now curled around him like a lover's breath. He did not flinch. He did not pray. He only listened, for in the roar of fire, there were voices. Low, slithering, reverent, speaking not in Latin but in secrets. They did not come from heaven. They came from within. He returned to Brittany not as a knight, but as a husk draped in gold. His castle welcomed him with banners and feasts, but he walked through the corridors like a man sleepwalking into his own mausoleum. The walls seemed narrower, the air thicker. Tapestries moved when no wind stirred. At night, beneath the vaulted ceiling of his boyhood bedchamber, he heard the distant sound of metal, chains dragging, locks turning, though no cell lay beneath the keep. He ordered priests to bless the halls, and when they fled by morning, pale and shaking, he called for silence and never summoned them again. He began collecting relics, bones of saints, slivers of the true cross, vials of what was claimed to be Christ's blood. Yet the more he surrounded himself with holiness, the more the rot crept in. Paint peeled, servants whispered of cold spots, of dogs howling at empty corners. Gilles himself grew strange, indulgent, extravagant, fixated on angels who came to him in dreams with mouths full of teeth and eyes weeping black tar. He claimed they whispered revelations. Others said they screamed. The heir of Brittany, once the pride of his house and a companion to the Virgin Martyr, began to withdraw into rooms whose doors remained locked for days, behind which only flickering candlelight and muffled chanting could be discerned. On feast days, he would appear radiant, fragrant with oils, his smile wide, too wide, and his fingers twitching as if stroking invisible strings. When asked of Joan, he would gaze into the fire and murmur, "She showed me God," but he turned away. It was not madness, not yet, but something had entered him, or awakened, and the angels were silent. By the year 1435, the last vestiges of Gilles de Rais' knighthood had crumbled beneath the weight of velvet and vanity. No longer did he ride into battle beneath the fleur-de-lis, his blade an extension of divine wrath. Instead, he slipped through corridors draped in crimson, a ghost masquerading in gold-threaded silks. His smile stretched taut like wax over a skull. The castle of Tiffauges, once a proud fortress of stone and chivalry, had decayed into something far more obscene, a stage where sanity unraveled beneath flickering torchlight, and every wall pulsed with the memories of unseen crimes. The great hall, where once nobles feasted and prayers echoed, had been transformed into a macabre theater, a shrine to theatrical perversion where Gilles, drunk on ancient wine and narcotic powders, directed plays that bled into blasphemy. He wrote scripts scrawled in charcoal and pig's blood, casting servants and strangers into roles they neither understood nor survived. There were scenes of damnation, where women were stripped and bound in mockeries of Christ's crucifixion, and actors in demon masks licked the blood from their thighs as the audience howled with a mirth that reeked of rot. During one infamous performance, whispered of in terrified tones by the few who survived it, a living goat was disemboweled mid-stage, its entrails flung into the crowd like garlands, as children dressed as angels danced on all fours, sobbing through painted smiles. And Gilles, perched high on a throne of bone and brocade, watched it all with a gaze so distant it seemed fixed on some unseen chasm just beyond the veil of mortal sight. He had begun to collect men of science, or so they called themselves, alchemists with broken teeth and trembling hands, who promised gold from gallstones, immortality from infant marrow, and communion with spirits if only the ritual were pure enough, the sacrifice innocent enough. They were paid in flesh. In the catacombs beneath the chapel, beneath where the bones of saints once rested, Gilles constructed laboratories of horror, iron tools, hooks, knives worn down by use, jars of black liquid that clung to the glass like sentient tar. These replaced relics and rosaries. And from the tower above, where the wind moaned like a dying beast, the children came. They arrived quietly at first, the sons of peasants, the forgotten, the unclaimed. Gilles called it education, a chance for the lowborn to rise, to learn letters and scripture and the ways of court. Mothers wept with gratitude, fathers bowed, offering their sons like lambs. But the castle swallowed them whole. Days passed, then weeks. No letters, no laughter, no return. Servants, those not yet silenced by gold or terror, began to whisper of strange sounds from behind locked doors. The echo of weeping, the sudden thud of something heavy falling, followed by a silence so absolute it seemed to press against the lungs. One maid swore she heard chanting, not Latin but something older, wetter, the syllables slick and gurgling, as though recited underwater. Another claimed to have seen Gilles emerging from the tower barefoot, his nightshirt stained with something dark and crusted, muttering about fire that would not consume and angels that watched but did nothing. Tapestries began to curl at the edges, as if recoiling from the walls themselves. A copper tang lingered in the air, unmistakable. Iron, yes, but layered with decay, like the scent of a butcher's pit after days of summer heat. The floorboards near the west wing turned black in strange, circular patterns, and no scrubbing could lift them. At night, the castle seemed to breathe, a long, rasping inhalation of stone and shadow. And always, came the low sound of dragging metal, though no chain was ever found. Gilles withdrew deeper into his chambers. Days would pass with no sight of him. The guards posted outside swore they heard voices, dozens of them, speaking in murmurs that grew louder until they became shrieks. Then silence again. Sometimes they saw boys enter. None ever left. When questioned, Gilles de Rais would simply smile and murmur that God demands offerings for vision. His hands, once calloused from swordplay, were now soft and slick, as though constantly bathed in oil, or something thicker. Then came the bones. Shallow pits dug into the earth near the orchard revealed charred fragments, finger bones, tiny skulls half collapsed from heat, teeth fused together in lumps of calcified agony. The fires in the hearths, it was discovered, burned not only wood. The stench of marrow and hair soaked into the chimneys. Black smoke curled even on windless days, and yet he called it art. He claimed it was theater, but this was not stagecraft. It was scripture rewritten in blood. It was ritual carved into the flesh of the innocent. It was the unraveling of a man once bathed in grace, now bathing in the entrails of children to summon gods who never answered. Or worse, did. By the time the whispers reached the church, it was already too late. The tower had devoured its last breath. The stage had gone dark, and in the silence, one could hear it still. The faint rustle of curtains, the last gurgle of a throat, the applause of something ancient in the shadows. There comes a point in damnation when the line between man and myth rots away, where prayers become incantations and flesh becomes parchment. A canvas for madness etched in the script of agony. For Gilles de Rais, that line dissolved in the year 1437, when he ceased to walk as a nobleman and began to crawl through the corridors of his own mind as a supplicant to hell. His body a vessel emptied of reason, thirsting not for absolution, but for revelation through torment. The chambers beneath Tiffauges, once wine cellars and vaults of gold, had become sanctuaries of sacrilege. They pulsed with unnatural warmth, as though the stone itself had grown veins and began to bleed. A foul, gelatinous humidity that slicked the air with the metallic perfume of decay. The walls were blackened with soot and symbols, not the Latin of priests, but something older, angular and jagged, carved into the masonry with fingers worn to bone. Rats bred in the corners like thoughts unspoken, and their squeals sounded eerily like laughter when the torches sputtered low. There, beneath crumbling arches and the slow drip of stagnant water, Gilles de Rais surrendered to the worship of agony. He summoned men from the edges of Europe, alchemists whose tongues were forked with mercury, necromancers whose eyes wept pus and spoke of having once touched the veil. They arrived cloaked in ashen teeth, bringing scrolls inked on lambskin, vials filled with dark liquids that moved of their own accord, and blades not made for combat, but for communion. Gilles welcomed them with open arms and naked flesh, his body painted with the blood of the latest child offered to the flame, his voice hoarse from nights spent shrieking broken Latin that twisted sacred hymns into invitations for demons. And the children, they came still, lured by coin, stolen in darkness, or handed over by desperate parents' promised favor. They were dragged into the ritual chamber beneath the castle chapel. There, their cries were swallowed by thick stone walls and choked by incense so acrid it burned the eyes of the guards who dared to approach. The floors were slick with gore, not dried but fresh, always fresh, as though some unseen maw drank greedily from the living and hungered still. Gilles conducted the rites naked, his pale skin marred by bite marks. Some his own, others not. He chanted through cracked lips and bleeding gums, inscribing circles of power using the marrow of his victims, positioning their limbs in star patterns and grotesque parodies of holy icons. The children's mouths were sewn shut with horsehair thread to silence the screams, but the walls remembered them. The stone absorbed their agony, and in quiet moments, even the servants swore they could still hear soft whimpering rising from the flagstones, like the prayers of ghosts too broken to ascend. He believed, or pretended to believe, that each slaughter opened a door. But no demons came, not visibly. No spirits tore through the veil. Only the heat grew stronger, only the shadows deeper, and only his dreams more vivid. Dreams where Joan of Arc appeared to him not as the sainted virgin, but as a scorched figure with empty sockets, whispering that God had turned his face away from France and left only Gilles to lead the faithful into fire. He would awaken screaming, bleeding from the nose, and immediately reach for his pen, dipping it not in ink but in his own blood, and write letters addressed to Lucifer himself, full of pleas, of oaths, of sacrifices promised and already given. "I offer my soul, my body, my seed, and the seed of the innocent," he wrote in one, found later stuck between the ribs of a headless corpse. "I have fed the flame, I have opened the gates. Why will you not speak to me?" But the only voice that answered was his own, echoing back, hoarse and mad, distorted by the madness that now clung to him like a second skin. Those who served him recoiled in terror, their silence born not of loyalty, but of a fear so total it paralyzed. One boy, a stable hand, was found hanging in the barn with his tongue nailed to a wooden icon of St. Michael. His suicide note, scrawled in dung on the floor, read, "He is not a man. He drinks the breath of angels." The castle priest, a man too frightened to flee, too devout to deny, performed exorcisms in secret, his hands trembling as he sprinkled holy water that hissed when it struck the walls. But nothing halted the decay. The crucifix in the chapel bled sap, and the Virgin statue was found shattered, her face replaced with a twisted mask crudely carved from the skull of a swine. By now, Gilles reeked not of perfume, but of bile and clotted blood, his robes stiff with layers of fluid, human and otherwise. His skin, once alabaster, now sagged in places as though something inside were pulling it downward. He could not sleep without nightmares. He could not eat without vomiting. He could not touch another human being without trembling. He believed he was being watched, not by men but by the hosts of heaven and hell alike. And he began wearing masks to conceal his face from the divine gaze he imagined burning into his skull. Even in daylight, he walked with a candle. Even in silence, he heard the choir. Even in his own breath, he tasted fire. And still, he begged. He begged for power, for revelation, for a sign. He begged the devil to kiss him. He begged Joan to return, to forgive him, to burn him. He begged God to kill him and end this farce. But none came. The only thing that arrived was another child, and another knife, and another night. By the year 1440, the land itself seemed to reject the presence of Gilles de Rais, as though the soil, once tilled by saints and soaked in the blood of martyrs, now seethed in protest beneath his castle's cursed dead foundations. The trees along the road to Tiffauges withered out of season, their bark split open like wounds, their leaves yellowing into a color not found in nature, but in fevered dreams. Birds no longer sang near the towers. Wolves howled in daylight. Milk soured in pails without reason, and children were born with teeth or with eyes that refused to blink. The peasants no longer prayed for blessings from the knight who once marched with Joan of Arc. They spat when they spoke his name and crossed themselves thrice to ward off the echo. Rumors festered like boils across the countryside, grotesque, inflamed things that burst in taverns and confessionals alike. They spoke of fires that never extinguished, of screams at dusk, of ghostly children seen dancing in fields, their limbs too long and their mouths sewn shut with golden thread. Women claimed to dream of Gilles sitting atop a throne of screaming infants, his eyes rolled back, his body dripping with wax and blood as he played a flute carved from a boy's femur. It was no longer heresy whispered in corners. It was hysteria, contagious and incurable. The church, which had once turned a blind eye to the sins of its golden knight, now recoiled like a body from infection. Priests refused to enter his lands. Benedictions were denied, no sacraments were offered, and Gilles, sensing the final unraveling of both his influence and his carefully constructed facade, turned on the very faith that once shaped his legend. The act was not subtle. In the spring of that year, during a quiet morning mass held in a village chapel just beyond his estate, Gilles stormed through the nave with a face twisted not by rage, but by something deeper, a kind of delirious, animal confusion, like a dog gone mad from hunger. His robes were crusted with filth and dried bodily fluids, and he stank of piss, sulfur, and rotting fruit. He seized the officiating cleric, a trembling young man barely past 20, and dragged him to the altar, his screams drowned by the bell's solemn toll. Witnesses would later describe what followed not as violence, but as desecration. Gilles defecated upon the altar cloth, tearing down the crucifix and driving a dagger into the wooden Christ's ribs. Laughing and sobbing in the same breath, he smeared human waste across the holy icons, painting over the Virgin's face with excrement while shrieking in a tongue no one understood. Not French, not Latin, but something guttural and wet, like the gargled speech of a drowning man. He declared God dead, rotted, eaten by worms beneath the cathedral floor. Then he turned to the congregation, his teeth blackened from wine, his lips bleeding from where he'd chewed through them in sleep, and whispered, "If there is a heaven, it has abandoned you all. I have seen the pit beneath the throne." He let the priest crawl free, only to collapse moments later, seizing, frothing from the mouth. Some claimed the boy was poisoned, others that he was simply overwhelmed by the scent of Gilles' breath, which by then was said to resemble the stench of an open tomb. The bishopric was notified, but no writ of arrest came. Even the church feared the thing that Gilles had become. The mirrors in the castle were all covered or broken. He claimed his reflection was changing, that it no longer mimicked him, but watched him with disapproval, mouthing words he could not hear. He refused to enter the chapel, claiming the floor bled when he stepped upon it. The crucifix above his bed split clean down the middle during a thunderstorm, and Gilles took it as an omen, that heaven had rejected him, and hell had accepted his tithe. And so he dressed in his finest velvet robes, now stained and infested with lice, and walked the corridors like a king of ash, speaking to the empty air, nodding to shadows that replied with silence. He was no longer a knight, no longer a man. He was a maggot, writhing in silk, feeding on memory, blind to the horror that festered within his own soul. Outside, the people prayed. Inside, God had left the building. By the waning days of the year 1440, the grotesque theater Gilles de Rais had built with flesh and madness collapsed under the weight of its own unspeakable rot, and the noble families of Brittany, once complicit in their silence, finally recoiled in collective disgust, as though waking from a long, fevered dream. It was not pity or morality that drove them, but fear. Fear that the thing inside the velvet robes had grown too monstrous to ignore, that the soil itself might rebel if his breath continued to fester upon it. He was seized not with dignity, but with spectacle. Dragged from his castle in rags soaked through with vomit and dried blood, Gilles de Rais did not scream. Not at first. He giggled, a soft, childish sound, like a boy overhearing a joke he didn't understand. His hands were raw from incessant scratching, his face crusted with layers of old wine and newer scabs, and his feet left wet fungal prints as he walked, barefoot and unwashed, across the smooth marble of the ducal court. His eyes, once fierce, once royal, now darted like those of a cornered rat, unable to focus, consumed by phantoms only he could see. The trial was not a hearing. It was an exorcism. Each day began with the tolling of bells that seemed too solemn for the courtroom, as though meant for a funeral rather than justice. The chamber reeked of fear and incense. Thick, suffocating plumes poured from censers in a futile attempt to cover the more earthly stench Gilles carried with him. The stench of mildew, bodily fluids, and something darker. Something like wet ash and curdled blood. Flies followed him. Always. Even indoors, even in winter. They hovered around his ears, his nose, his mouth, as if drawn to something sweet and decaying beneath his skin. He sat slouched on a wooden bench, wrists bound with iron shackles so old they left rusted trails in his veins. When the charges were read aloud, heresy, sodomy, necromancy, child murder, he laughed so violently he vomited, a bubbling mass of bile and wine-tainted blood that splashed onto the stone floor and sizzled like it had memory. Then, in the silence that followed, he began to confess. He spoke of the children in detail, so foul even the scribes faltered. He recalled binding their hands with silk, painting their faces with lamb's blood, arranging their bodies in poses mimicking saints and martyrs, though always inverted, always defiled, before taking them apart slowly, methodically, like one might disassemble a clock. He claimed their deaths were not cruelty, but transformation, that he was offering them to something greater, that he saw light as they screamed, and heard angels weep with envy at their purity. He said he kissed their severed heads before tossing them into the fire. He said he wore their intestines as garlands around his neck while chanting psalms written in reversed Latin. He said he drank their marrow to keep the dreams away, but the dreams only grew louder. The court listened in horror. Some wept. Others vomited openly. One guard fainted when Gilles began to mimic a child's death rattle, describing it as a music more beautiful than any cathedral's organ. A priest assigned to monitor his soul before the gallows attempted to claw his own eyes out, screaming that Gilles had shown him hell in the shape of a boy's skull. And all the while, Gilles swayed in his seat, humming lullabies under his breath. Lullabies no one else recognized, songs in no known language, their rhythm uneven and broken, like the footfalls of something crawling just behind the veil. He claimed that Joan of Arc had returned to him, not in fire, but in shadow, that he saw her each night, draped in ash and dripping blood from her eyes, standing beside the judge, whispering to the flames behind the crucifix. He said she no longer burned. She watched, and she judged. His skin had begun to fester, ulcerations blooming like black flowers across his chest and thighs. The doctors summoned to examine him recoiled. One insisted Gilles had been marked, not with disease, but with wrath, his flesh rejecting the soul inside it. His gums bled without provocation. His stool was black with clotted blood and bone fragments he claimed were his own sins, expelled one at a time. The air around him was dense, warm, always moving, as if he carried a personal storm that sucked breath and light from those near him. By the end, Gilles de Rais was no longer seen as a man, but as a symbol, not merely of moral collapse, but of spiritual vacancy, a once glorious knight who had torn open the veil between flesh and the void and offered himself wholly to what stared back. His final days in court were marked not by law, but by ritual, candles that never stayed lit, crucifixes that tilted toward the floor, birds falling dead near the windows, and a coldness in the room that no hearth could banish. The sentence was inevitable: death by hanging and burning, not to punish, but to cleanse, to cauterize, to rid the land of the rot that once wore the face of a savior. But even then, no one dared say his name after sunset. On the pale morning of the 26th of October, in the year 1440, as a sickly sun rose behind a curtain of low-hanging clouds that looked more like bruises than sky, the final act of Gilles de Rais, once Marshal of France, once hero of Orléans, once God's knight, began not with drums or fanfare, but with silence so total it swallowed the breath of those gathered to witness the execution. The square was packed shoulder to shoulder, a mass of bodies slick with sweat and dread. Yet no one spoke, no one moved. Even the birds refused to sing, as if the world itself was holding its tongue in awe or horror, or both. The scaffold had been prepared at dawn, its planks stained with the ghosts of prior deaths, but never one so cursed, so steeped in the foul alchemy of sacred betrayal and monstrous lust. At its center, a stake of seasoned oak stood tall, splintered at the top, bound with iron clamps designed not only to restrain, but to expose, to render the condemned not just dead, but displayed, examined, stripped of mystery and myth. And when Gilles was led into the square, he did not walk so much as drift, his feet barely lifting, his robes trailing behind him like the remnants of a corpse fished from a bog. His skin was jaundiced, ulcered, and flaking in ribbons. His lips were cracked and black, oozing a tar-like substance that bubbled with each ragged breath. His once proud beard was matted with lice and dried pus, his teeth broken and red at the roots, and his eyes, those infamous, piercing blue eyes, were now glassy, dull, searching not for salvation, but for reason, as if even in these final moments, he could not fathom the scale of the abyss he had built and willingly leapt into. But worst of all was the smell. Even from 20 paces, those near the platform gagged as the breeze carried the odor. An impossible stench, not simply of rot, but of history spoiled, of something once sacred now infested with maggots and memory. One monk was seen weeping into his sleeves. Another whispered to the wind, He wears his sins like a shroud. They allowed him to speak. Perhaps it was mercy, perhaps spectacle. Perhaps the Duke of Brittany hoped that some final confession would quiet the growing rumors that Gilles had not acted alone, that other nobles, other priests, other kings had sipped from the same chalice of blood and perversion. But what emerged from Gilles de Rais' lips was not confession. It was a sermon, grotesque, tearful, and blasphemously tender. He begged, not for his own soul, he claimed that was long lost, but for forgiveness from the mothers of the children he had desecrated, incinerated, silenced beneath stone and song. He wept until black tears streaked his cheeks, as something beneath his skin twitched and writhed, maggots bulging beneath a thin layer of tissue, like worms trapped in a veil of wax. He fell to his knees, the bones cracking audibly, and kissed the bloodied earth. "I see them," he cried. "They dance, they laugh, they forgive me. Do you?" No one answered. And so the pyre was lit. The flames rose fast, too fast, as if starved, ravenous, preordained. They licked at his legs, curled into his robes, devoured his flesh with a wet hiss that sounded eerily like laughter. Witnesses claimed that Gilles did not scream, not at first. Instead, he sang, a low, guttural hymn no one recognized, in a language older than Latin, older than France itself. The cords in his neck stood out, his mouth open wide in defiance or ecstasy, until at last the fire kissed his lungs, and what remained was a shriek so long and so sharp that glass cracked in the windows of the chapel 2 streets away. Mothers turned their children's faces, dogs howled, and some swore the church bell tolled, though no hand touched the rope. And when the flames had died, and the ash cooled into a shape almost human but wholly wrong, they found the iron stake warped and twisted, not by fire, but by something else, something unseen, something that refused to die with him. His death did not cleanse the land. The sky remained heavy, the earth remained dry. No rain fell on Tifages that winter. The castle stood, blackened, gutted, yet strangely intact, and travelers who passed by swore they heard laughter echoing from its tower, the high-pitched giggle of children playing in an empty room. The villagers left flowers at the gates for years after, though they would never say for whom. Gilles de Rais was not merely a man, and his end was not merely a death. He was a symbol of power unmoored from virtue, of glory rotted into hunger, of the terrifying truth that even the holiest banners can hide a butcher's hands. France had given birth to a saint and a monster, wrapped them both in armor, and sent them into battle to save her soul. But one had burned in innocence, while the other burned in guilt, and the ashes of both still haunt her soil. He was the lie of chivalry, the disease beneath the crown, the ghost in the cathedral. And as long as there are towers without doors, prayers without answers, and smiles that hide a hunger too great to name, Gilles de Rais will not sleep. Not in heaven, not in hell, not anywhere.